Hi, I'm Allie with PotomacBeads, and in this Better Beader episode, we are going to talk about what happens when you have that dreaded bead that breaks. So if you're in the middle of a project or you've been wearing something for a while, you have that bead that snaps and breaks. Most of them are glass, so don't be surprised if it happens. And I want to show you how to resolve that without having to take the project apart. There are some cases where you're not going to be able to fix it, but in some cases you can cleverly tuck the thread and sew in a new bead. Join me as I go over some different ways and techniques to cover up and to replace these broken beads. So for demonstration purposes, I did it and I broke the bead here. Now you can see this delicate in this fun Cellini spiral is broken. It's hard to tell because the bottom half is still tucked underneath and has the thread above it. There's two ways. Number one, take a little bit of glue, drop the glue on there and just keep that broken bead. You may not be able to see it the whole way on your jewelry. However, if you don't want to do that, you don't have a little bit of glue that you want to drop on there, what you do need to do is get out the remnants of the broken bead. So the broken bead is going to generally have thread in it, and you're going to have to kind of push along it, twist it to the side, see how it's coming up towards the top. It's almost like doing surgery. You break out that extra little bead. If you want to, again, you can use just your grabber here and grab some glue, flip it over, glue it in there and just say good to go. But what happens if you want to actually replace that bead? Sometimes it doesn't really matter. You don't have to replace the bead. Just keep it there. You won't see it. If it's killing you, definitely replace the bead. So what I have here is I have a different colored bead so you can keep track of what the actual bead is and where it's coming from. In the project, there was some gray thread used. I'm going to use white just for demonstration purposes so you can see it. What you're going to want to do is you can see where the bead needs to be there. There's that little gap. Further down in the project, start up with some new thread. This is a great way to just keep some scraps of thread on hand and around. And I'm just using one that was here already. I'm getting to the portion where the bead would be, and I'm going to add the bead right on top. Now, yes, you will see a little portion of the other thread, but what we're hoping to do is push the old thread towards the bottom. I'm going to sew on a diagonal. This was a peyote stitch. See how it's kind of on the side there? I'm going to sew back through here because my thread didn't break, just my bead. I want my bead to cooperate, and you can see I'm just sewing new thread lines for that new peyote stitch to make it sit correctly. And something in a spiral like this is pretty easy to conceal and hide that extra thread that's sitting behind there. When it comes in the flat, I'll show you how to do that as well. But with this rounded stitch, you're just going to go back in, weave a couple times through. Now you don't want to do too many times because then it's going to even bring more thread to that tension point and that connection point. But you're going to weave back in through the stitch, whether or not it's something like this, which is the tubular peyote, or a herringbone, and the previous thread is sitting below the project on the inside. Then I'm going to take my thread and needle, sew it down, and then tie off the thread and make sure that it's in a spot where I'm not going to see it, like towards the back. And then if you can, when you have a tubular project like this, actually put the needle through the tube and try to pull the knot inside the interior of the tube. So you can sew back through there, replacing the extra bead. With the tubular stitches, again, it's usually a little bit easier. So we're going to progress, and I'm going to show you how to do it on a flat stitch as well. So I had to do it again. Here's a freeform peyote bracelet. So we went from Cellini to now a freeform, or any peyote bracelet really. I broke one of the 8/0 seed beads here. Hate to do it, but what I'm going to do is spin it around just like I said. So half the bead generally is still sometimes going to be on there. You want to make sure to completely remove the bead or glue it in place if you happen to have the other half. So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to remove the bead and make sure that I take it off completely. And there's that gap and that missing space right there. You can see it better here with those black lines towards the bottom. Again, with this, if you want to, grab some glue, glue it down, and put it on there. You can also, if you want to, since the glue will be there, you don't want to see the underside, one idea is actually to take some ultra suede and completely cover the back. This works really well for a pair of earrings if you have a broken bead. Cover the whole thing in ultra suede along the back, and it looks like it was completely meant to be. So same deal here, this is flat. Because I don't have the opportunity to tuck my extra bead and the thread kind of that was underneath it into a rounded section. We're going to do the same thing here, grabbing another 8/0 seed bead. So same thing, I'm going back a couple stitches. And then I'm going to come forward here. I'm going to snake back here along the piece. Let me just come out through the side. I don't want to see any extra thread, which obviously I'm going to, because again, going from black thread so it can push down, and I picked these specifically because of the color threads. So I'm coming out right where I need to be. I'm going to grab an extra bead, continue with the stitch. Now this one's a free form peyote stitch, so what you want to do when it's a flat stitch is try to move those threads off to the side. If you move them to the back or the bottom, you're going to see them a little bit. We do want to push them a little bit to the bottom, but really what I want to do is push them off to the sides of the piece. So I'm just going in here. Think about this as kind of sewing on a new button. See, the thread will push off to the exterior line on both sides. And when I flip it over then, after I bring it down through both sections, see it there? You can see that black thread line on the sides of the beads, but it's not terrible, especially because it's near that black bead. If you have a broken bead near a white bead and you're using black thread, switch to white thread. So you can always do this with a little bit of a spare piece of thread. Once you have that bead sitting correctly then, same deal. Take your thread and needle and make sure that it's off to the side, and that where you tie your knot is not also where the bead is. So that way you have the knot tied off along the sides and your new bead is right in there. Now you may say, what about if it's a herringbone stitch? What about if it is a right angle weave stitch? The same deal. You're going to end up with those stitches and with the extra bead right off to the side. Here's something that commonly happens also with clasps or buttons. See here how we have a lot of missing beads. Now on this little clasp here, and this was a little button clasp that we had done, so if you want to learn how to do the actual bezeled button cabochons, you can make a little button out of it, you can go in and you can restitch. So if you have a couple beads that are missing, never fear, you can do the exact same thing, where you're starting a little bit back and skirting through multiple beads as you go from one side to the other. And just look and line up and see where the beads are missing. And again, think of it almost like a zipper that you're sewing back up and adding the beads. You will still see some of that thread, and you can see that black thread line there a little bit right there. And you'll still see that a little bit, but you're not going to see it a ton. So by the time you go in and you pick up your new Delica beads in that same color and sew them in, that will fill that gap. Why does it happen a lot that you'll have beads that break around a bezel? Because you're trying to pull the bezel too tight. So if you happen to see this and you look back at your count and you say, all right, what is my count? Or did the item drop? Maybe the count is too small. It's trying to pull too tight, and then it's putting stress on those beads. It's also a learning experience to realize and count and say, all right, the next time I do this size cab, if I want to do an 18mm cab inside of a Rivoli bezel here, how many beads am I going to do? So it's a learning experience, but you're going to do the exact same thing, stitching up from side to side. There's no way really to get rid of the extra thread lines unless you go in with your thread zap or your thread burner, burn a couple lines before it, but that honestly takes a ton of time. Like I said, one of the good options to do is to take a bead and actually take a little bit of ultra suede. So say I had a bead here that popped on the back of the everyday earrings right there. Rather than actually going in and sewing the beads, I'll just cut out a piece of ultra suede and glue it right to the back to cover up that seed bead issue. So don't always think that you need to just sew a new bead in to that area and that new space. You can also cover that up with an additional embellishment. So if I'm going back to the Cellini here and I say, oh man, I missed a bead there, maybe let's sew in some crystals every once in a while. So you can go back into the design, pick some crystals off, and actually sew them into the design and make them part of it. That you embellish with a new bead or a bigger bead on top of where that older bead was. That's another little trick or a technique how to fix those broken beads. When you have a broken bead outside of the peyote stitch too, say you have one along this chevron V here, and these are all just simple seed bead patterns. So if you have this chevron V here, you have one broken along the side, I wouldn't even worry about it. If you have something along the back here where there's a baseline, same deal. It's not going to affect your project. So don't think you have to fix every single broken bead. No one's going to see it on the underside if there's only 2 here rather than 3 beads along the line. So keep that in mind. Same deal here. If you want to cut a piece of ultra straight or a strip of leather, you can just attach it right to there. If you have something like this where it's the V and you have one missing bead along the side in the pattern, again, don't really worry about it. Just keep that bead off and you won't see it. But if you do have gaps in the stitch where you see a lot of the thread, when it's a flat stitch like this or a rounded one that you see the gap, or even a button where you see some of those broken beads, definitely go in there. Again, make sure that you're removing all those half pieces of beads, and I like to do this with my beading awl here. This is the tulip beading awl. It's a super, super helpful tool. You can go in, take off all those remnants, or put them towards the top, do a little glue, and have them in right there. So whether or not you have a broken bead that you can just kind of flip the other half towards the top, glue it in, you have to remove it completely and redo your thread line and stitch that bead in, seeing just a little bit of threads on the side of it, the peyote, or even if it's the herringbone stitch, or if you want to go the different route and just back it with a little bit of ultra suede, cover up that area where you have the actual missing bead, you can do that as well. I can't wait to actually see your suggestions underneath. So don't forget to comment below and say how you go about fixing things like the broken bead. Say you have a peyote stitch project or a loom project and you really don't want to see those lines. I think a lot of people are going to say they just take some ultra suede or leather cork and glue on top of that. But you can also see everybody's comments. I would love to see, how do you fix a broken bead in your project? Also, I like the idea of just embellishing on top of where that bead was. So instead of having that little delica bead go back in place, stick a 4mm crystal there, add a little bling or a little bit extra in the design as well. Put a little charm there, put a little button there, or again, that little crystal embellishment. You can also even drop in a little chaton for a little extra bling along the piece. Remember that if you can, also give a little thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss anything from us here at Potomac Beads. I really do rely on community members like yourself watching to comment below and really build up people's skills to make them better beaders. As always, thank you so much for watching. Hopefully this Saturday morning you learned a little bit of tips, techniques, or tricks to fix that broken bead in your project. As always, happy beading and thanks so much for watching.